Hello everyone and welcome back to CasaCloud, your ultimate destination for mastering Devops Cloud and now Node.js. Today we are kicking off an exciting new series where we'll be building production-ready Node.js application from scratch. And this is the first episode where we'll be laying down the foundation with the essentials. Like we'll be setting up the project with TypeScript, not the plain JavaScript. Then we'll be setting up the logging with Winston, which will keep track of your application activities. Then we'll be doing the API request tracking. That means we'll be setting up a request ID for each and every request that comes to your server, and we'll be attaching all the logs against a particular request. That is very interesting and essential when we do debug in the production level application. Then we'll be setting up Grunt here as our task automator to set up the development environment to continuously run the application. Once we do any kind of activity, it will be converting TypeScript into JavaScript as we change the source code, which will help us optimize our time during the development. Then we'll be linting our project using the TS lint, and last we'll be setting up the Swagger documentation for our APIs that we'll be exposing from our server. This Swagger API documentation can be utilized by various teams like front-end development team, where we can just share them what are the API parameters, what is the request looks like, and what are the example and what is the schema of the API. So let's kickstart. The source code is present already inside the repository CasaCloud. Here you can see Node.js TypeScript blueprint. This is the repository that you can directly clone, and this is what we are going to understand today about the structure of this Node.js application. In the main branch, this is the main branch where the code exists, and to pull the code you need to go to code. You can use HTTP link and then copy this, and in your favorite IDE you need to do git clone and paste the link and just press enter, and you'll have all the source code just like here. Okay, once you complete the git clone, then let's go through the project structure. The project structure includes majorly the src folder where we have all the source code. The server.js is the first file where the controller hits. Before that, before going to this server.ts file, I want to introduce you the tslint.json. This is the linting file. This will make sure that whatever source code that we have, it is compiled with a standard, and if there is error in the syntax, then it will try to suggest us during the recompilation that unless and until you do not fix this particular code issue, I cannot let the server proceed to start. Okay, so this is very helpful file for us. Then we have the tsconfig file. This tsconfig file is utilized to convert the TypeScript to JavaScript. TSC is the compiler that we use internally. So this is the file that supports the rules through which it has to convert the TypeScript to JavaScript. Like here the target is ES5, that is ECMAScript 5. So the TypeScript that we are writing is getting converted into ES5. Okay. Then we have the readme file. Readme file has the clear instructions what to do. First step is always we need to do the npm install. So let's consider you have just downloaded this particular repository. You will never have this node module folder inside your source code, right? To get this folder includes all the dependencies, the dependent package, and to install that we just need to do npm install in the root folder. This will install all the dependent package which are listed in package.json. This includes two sections majorly. The dev dependencies includes all the dependent libraries during the development time, and then we have the runtime dependencies, which are the packages required during the runtime. Okay, so this is all. And now we have the grunt file. The grunt file, as I said, it is a task runner. Okay, so which task that we are trying to run? It is a default task. We'll just write a command grunt default, and it will do 3 tasks for us. The first task is the TS, that is TypeScript. let's see the definition of this TS. Let's see the definition of the TS now. The TS is built, and what it is building, it is using the TS config file which is present here, and then it is trying to search all the .ts files which are present inside the src folder, and it will try to convert all those files from TypeScript to JavaScript with these options that we have offered. Okay. Next is the environment variable file, that is .env file. This particular .env file will have all the environment variables required for this server, because eventually we'll be running this particular Node.js server as a microservice inside Kubernetes. So we'll be passing these environment variables runtime through the Kubernetes configuration, or if you are using plain Docker, then we need to pass a Docker file, which is the Docker environment file with this environment variables with it. So right now, which are the variables? These are the two variables that will be required. The server will be running on port 8085, and I'm enabling the Swagger API. Okay, so that is the one. I hope you got till now. And then we have the configuration file, which is the config file. This includes all the static variables inside the source code, or all the configuration inside the source code. And one more thing is, it is majorly here to pull all the environment variables first. That's why we have the .env as a package which is configured and which is trying to pull all the variables which are present inside this .env file. And if this .env file is not present, then it will try to pull it from the process.env, that is the environment where it is trying to execute, the server is trying to execute. If you are trying to run this in your local, then it will try to find the environment variables inside your local. If this is in a VM in any of the cloud, then it will check that particular environment, that VM environment, for these variables like port number and Swagger enable. Okay, I guess we are good. Then we have few more definitions here. These two are for the logger, Winston logger. This is the setup. We'll go through this. And then we have the Swagger definition. These are the Swagger, some configuration related to Swagger definition. We'll go through this, and then some configuration. Using this config file, we are passing all these above variables and exporting this out of this configuration file. Okay, I guess now you got all around picture. So now let's start with the server.ts, which is our main file of this server. Whenever the server start, it will always come, the controller will come to this particular file. So here what we are doing, this Node.js application is based on the Express framework, which is widely popular. We are including the Swagger documentations, importing Swagger UI Express and Swagger JS docs, and then pulling the configuration file. As you see, we just talked about that configuration file. There is a response message file. What is a response message file? We are trying to standardize the responses that each and every request that comes to server, there will be a format of response. What kind of format it will be? Just let's see for a glance. We'll go through this in depth later, but the response format has only two methods, the response error and response success, and it will always return the response in this structure. That is, it will pass the message. When it is trying to send some success message, it will pass the message, details about the message, and the request ID. We'll go through request ID exactly what it is, but these are the only three things, and the status code. This is the standard format, so that whenever a front end is trying to grab some kind of details, he will always be knowing that this is the format that server will send. Okay, and definitely you can validate that eventually in these Swagger docs as well. Okay, and similar we have the response error, which has this particular format. Let's get back. Then we have the user management route. The user management route is the router file that we need to pull. which is present here. Let's see the user management route. What it is doing is it is pulling the router from the Express framework. It is importing the controller, because eventually when this particular route will be called, the control will go to this user group controller. Okay, and here we are setting up the constructor, and inside the constructor we have only one route for this server, which is get details. This is just a dummy route, nothing related to user. It is just to showcase you that a particular API works, and this is how it works. Right now we are just doing the framework of the application. In the later videos we'll do some meaningful APIs that will matter to us, but this is important to understand the structure. Okay, so for this get details API, it is calling this user group controller get details. Where it is? User group controller get details. Let's open this user group controller, which is present in the controller folder. What it is doing, it is pulling the config file that we have, pulling some constants, initiating the constant. The constant is having just few constant keywords, just like error detail. We'll go through the error detail later, but yeah, this is the method which is getting called. First is we have the response.logger. Eventually we are trying to basically log the request ID and just let know that the controller came to this particular function, and just returning a successful response. And if something goes bad, if there is an error during the process, then I am first logging up with some constant error which is coming into the constant file, and returning this particular response from the response message structure. Okay, this is my user group controller. Let's go back to server. Setting up the Express application using the maximum JSON limit of 50 MB. That depends on your application, how much you wish to process. So where we are setting up the logger, so here we are trying to set up the logger inside the response.locals.logger, and it is coming from the config.logger. Let's go back to the config folder that we have. This is the config folder, and here when we are trying to send the logger is nothing but the create logger. We are using Winston here, and it is using the label. So this label is just a sample label which will be added to each and every log that will be generated. The timestamp will be in this particular format, so each log will have this timestamp. Every data will be in JSON prettify, so that will see the logs in the formatted way, and then the colorize. That means the JSON will have its own color. Transport is very powerful thing. Right now we just have the transport of console, but we can have multiple transports, like send these logs to a particular API, send this log to some particular server. Those also transports are available, but we are right now only using very basic transport, that is just only log in the terminal. There is one more transport which is being used, that is this one, which is daily rotate file. What I'm doing is I'm pushing all the logs in a file name called as logs/log dash the date, which is today's date, .json file. So this is the log.json file, and the date pattern will be always like this: zipped archive true, size max 10, max file is 50, and extension is .json. Because extension is .json, it is here .json. And what this thing is, whenever either the max size will pass 10 MB or the file size, that means the total file becomes 50, it will be zipping it and shrinking the logs so that it should not take more space inside the server. So this is the logger setup that we did, and we set it inside the request.local.logger, and we can use this response.local.logger inside any other file where the control goes with response. Like in user group controller, we have this response.local.logger, and we are doing the info here, and we're just printing the request ID. We'll go through what is this request ID, but I guess up till now you understood how we set up the logging part. Now we have the request ID thing. What is request ID? I'm using a middleware in which I'm just setting up a random value, which we call it as request ID, and that request ID I'm setting up to response.local.request ID. So what will happen? All the requests that are coming, let's suppose my server got hit with 1000 API requests from 1000 users. All 1000 APIs will have its own request ID. And let's suppose one of the users said, I got non 200 response. That means I got an error inside my API response. Then always the user or the browser will always have a request ID attached to the error details, and that request ID will be passed over to the server team to debug what exactly wrong happened during that request. And how would we use that? Like for example, let's go to the log files, and here you will see we have the request ID attached to each and every log. So we can see with this request ID where the control went, till what point the control went, and where it shown the error. So this request ID is very useful for the debug purpose in the production. So this is what we are setting up, request ID. Okay, so same thing, just like we passed the logger, Winston logger, just like we passed the local request ID, we are passing the response message as well. We are just creating an instance of the response message where we have the success and failure response structure. So this is what I am passing through response.local.response message. Response message instance we can use everywhere, return response.local.response message, and it will be sent to the client directly from this server. This is just to standardize the response structure. Okay, so next is we are instantiating the router, which is user management router, which we have pulled. This is the user management router. This is what we are instantiating, and my base path of this particular router is api.v1.user, and after api.v1.user the route path will be utilized inside this, just like get details. So what is the complete path? It is api/v1/user/get details. Okay, so this is the API structure. Now comes the Swagger. In the Swagger we are just enabling, checking if the Swagger has to be enabled, because in production scenario we do not prefer to enable Swagger documentation, so that the Swagger details should not be leaked, the API details should not be leaked. But on the lower environment we'll always keep it open for other teams to access it. That's why we have a control if the Swagger is enabled, which is true, which we are passing through this particular environment variable. If it is true, then we'll be setting up the Swagger documentation, which is present in config.swaggerdoc, where it is config.js and Swagger definition. Okay, so Swagger definition is this, where we are just setting up the name, the current version of the API, few description, localhost, how it should look, some basic security, and which APIs it should search for the definition of the Swagger API. Let's take an example of this user route. This particular route, this is the complete API. It's a GET request, some summary, some description, few tags that we wish to give. What is the parameter for this particular API? Name, description. Inside the query, required true. This is only one parameter, that the details that we are asking for in this particular request, GET request. And then what are the responses expected from this particular request is 200, request handled successfully, and if it is 500, internal server error. So these are the responses. And as this application matures, as we get multiple error types, multiple response types, that will be keep adding it. Okay, so this is the Swagger documentation. We'll see how it looks once we start the server. Okay, so all these things are good. Swagger is set up with some Swagger options. There is some Swagger option as well. So this is the Swagger option where I'm just setting up some coloring to the Swagger documentation and a image which should be shown inside the Swagger page. This is just the customization. Okay, perfect. Now we came to the function where the server is getting started. I'm just utilizing the application, which is the instance of the Express, and listening on the port. The port is coming from the environment variable, which is here. It is 8085, and I'm starting my server there, just printing that the server has started and keeping the session timeout. Session timeout keeping is when we know that the server will be processing for a long time, so we can keep the session timeouts as well. If there is some error, then it will print the error. Let's try running the server. What are the steps? First is grunt default. By grunt default, because there are few things that I've already completed which are given in readme. First is npm install, that is already completed. I already have my packages present inside the package folder, where it is inside the node module. So we are ready to serve. Then do grunt default. See, it is trying to compile. Once it's compiled, we can see this dist folder came in picture, and all the TypeScript files that we had here are now converted into JavaScript files. Perfect. And whenever the server runs, the server will never run the TypeScript. It will always run the JavaScript. Okay, let's see what are the logs that I see here. I see that the config swagger enabled, that is one of our log, and this is all coming from the Winston. Okay, swagger is enabled. This is the first log. Second log is the server is listening on the port, which is here. The server is listening on the port and the port. These are the two logs. Okay, let's look into the Swagger documentation file now. Where will we look? The server URL /API docs. Let's go here to localhost :8080/API docs. Let's see. Here I have the Swagger documentation file. The API that we were expecting, that is API-v1/user/get details. And if we open this particular one, we can try it out. This UI is not created by us. This is offered by Swagger. We have only given this definition file. From where have we given this? We have given this from this particular definition, which is included in the star. This is rendered inside this UI, and now it is expecting a group name. Right now there is nothing in particular, but I can give like CasaCloud and then execute it. We can see this is the curl request which got executed. This is the complete URL. I got a response 200, and this is the format that I got, that is message, details, and the request ID. I told you each and every request will get the request ID. Let's see against this particular request ID what are the logs generated. Let's go back here. Now I don't know what are the logs. What will I do? I'll go to logs folder. This is the log file created. I'll just Control F, Control V. See, this is really simple now. I can just understand the first request went here for node template, then it went to new request, then request.body was printed, and then we have the response success message against this particular request. Only simple thing, but just think on, you have hundreds and hundreds of requests each minute, and this particular request ID concept will help you debug all the errors very fluently. Okay, later in the course we'll see how should we export these logs to the external log management tool, but for now this is all I wanted to showcase to you in this particular video. Please stay tuned for the next videos where we'll be trying to create an containerized image of this application, and we'll eventually deploy this in Kubernetes. Thank you so much for watching. Have a good day.